Vanguard Academy on Krasoa Primus, Premier Autocracy Officer Training School. Instructriarch Tessiwoka glowered at her class as she so often did, slowly tapping her disciplinary staff against the flat of her palm. She was not upset over rowdy or disruptive class members. One did not make it this far in the autocracy without being able to quell unrest. But she had an issue finding out the best way to beat philosophy into her students. When she had first argued to add the course to the academy curriculum, she hadn't foreseen just how difficult a task that would be. How did her human counterparts manage it, she wondered idly from time to time. Their methodology seemed to involve far less beating in general. Perhaps it had something to do with mental fatigue and constant exercise? She'd look into it. Pupil Ayank. She pointed her staff at one of the large chag at the back of the room. Their species had been added to the autocracy 3 centuries prior, due to their sturdy physique and aggressive nature. Their shoulders and heads encased in thick bone ridges, which had given them an exceptional predatory edge on their homeworld, and made them ideal shock troops for the autocracy. But while Ayank didn't fear combat, he did gulp nervously as the instructriarch singled him out. What is the point of this class? Why do I bother to even attempt to jam my vast knowledge into your various suboptimal cranial voids? Ah! The pupil shifted in his seat for a moment. 2. Give us insight into our greatest enemy? I mean to correct the title. Our most challenging foe so far. Ayank had learned that the instructriarch hated any one species being considered their greatest enemy, as it implied they'd never overcome them to discover a worse enemy. The instructriarch slowly tapped her disciplinary staff against her hand once more, before finally replying. A partial answer. Then, displaying her lightning speed, she raised the staff and struck Ayank across the top of his head as the staff discharged an electrical shock straight through his bone plate, making him hiss in pain and clutch his head. For a partial beating. She finished and slowly talked the rows of desks as the other pupils eyed her warily. Anyone else? She queried. When Pupil Rias raised his hand, she leveled the staff at him. His reptilian tongue flicked in the air for a moment before he spoke. To adapt our thinking in such a way to be better prepared for future conflicts, to understand better how to change. The instructriarch nodded slowly at the Sevesh. They'd been a part of the autocracy nearly as long as the Superialis. Thanks to their long, thin forms and natural adaptive coloring, they were often used in autocracy intelligence, not to mention as technicians and pilots. Not just how to change, but why. The instructriarch nodded and walked to the front of the class as she looked over their ranks once more. Would anyone like to say why it is the autocracy has been so successful? The pupils shifted a bit, and she noticed Ho many-eyed her staff, so she turned and set it on the desk, signaling that at least for now she would not punish wrong answers. She wanted greater input. Unity, one ventured. Many united species have fallen to us. She countered easily. Diverse citizenry, another quickly added. Are we the only government made of more than a single species? She countered again. Strong central leadership, she heard. How many crowns rest in the Hall of Victory? She asked. A heavily militarized society, came the next guess. How many of your ancestors were brought into the fold due to their militancy? How many more were militant but unworthy of citizenship? She said next. Extensive planning and intelligence operations? The instructriarch snorted as she heard another Sevesh pupil say that. One of the first lessons I taught you all was that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Have you forgotten that? She asked, and the pupil shifted nervously as he eyed the staff behind her. But she remained where she was still waiting. All of these things. When she heard that, she scanned the room and saw pupil Qualeria with her hand raised. The Nofraso were proof that not all species worthy of citizenship had to be large or menacing. With large eyes and a diminutive stature, the furred mammals had been underestimated by a great many other species, but they had survived their homeworld by being cunning and ruthless, which the autocracy admired. Once they'd been integrated, they had proven themselves to be extremely capable engineers and naval officers. All of these things, the instructriarch echoed. A great nation is not defined by a single attribute for very long before that strength can be turned against them. This is something we know well. Fill the ranks with species who each bring their own strength and erase our weaknesses. Structure society around these strengths, and we shall have no counter in the galaxy. Survival and prosperity, that is the core of the autocracy. So why then did our war with the humans go so disastrously? She noticed how the class shifted about nervously when she said that. Not all high-ranking officers within the autocracy like to admit that the war was a disaster, but she was not so weak or afraid of admitting error. As the students eyed her uniform that was resplendent with medals, commendations, and awards, they settled down a little before finally pupil Visan, another superialis like her, raised his hand. Failure to change, failure to adapt. Failure to change, failure to adapt. The instructriarch echoed. We had been victorious in every war for a millennia. What trouble would a single species cause us? A single isolated and technologically inferior species. And so with very little preparation, we attacked, and yet as we pushed deeper into their territory, everything we thought we knew about their tactics and tech changed. By the time we had finished creating comprehensive manuals on their military, they were already out of date. But how? With every planet we took, their forces looked relatively the same, yet by the end of the war they had changed completely. Any total overhaul of a military structure would take us a decade, and other species longer still, no doubt. So how did they manage it? This time she didn't expect any answers, and tapped a button on her desk to lower the lights and bring down the vid screen. This is perhaps my most significant discovery about the humans from my studies of their philosophy. Theseus's ship. She waved her hand at a diagram of an ancient human sailing ship. This has been a part of their learning structure for thousands of years before they even reached the stars. That's how ingrained it is in their culture. They would change one piece of the ship at a time until every piece of it was no longer original. The same ship, and yet entirely new. To change constantly and yet remain the same. This is the trick that the humans have managed in society and military. With every battle they would change and adapt. Little things, tiny things, constantly, so that after several battles it was like fighting an entirely different foe. She paused then, as one of the Sivesh raised her hand. Yes, pupil Kuzi. But how could they change parts of the ship while it was underway? Wouldn't it take significant time in a dry dock for that? The mast, for example, couldn't be replaced while being used, could it? The instructriarch frowned at that. The original idea involved sailing ships, but that's not what I'm focusing on. She tried to explain. Well, even modern starships, to adapt them in the void would be exceptionally dangerous, wouldn't it? Rias mentioned. It's not about changing parts of a starship in the void. Even humans can't do that. The instructriarch explained. I'm not saying that the entire human navy was changing parts of their ships between battles, though they did in small bits, but this isn't about that. What about one of their, planet munchers? The class looked back at Ayank, who slowly shrank down in his chair at the sudden attention. I believe you mean a World Eater-class ship? The instructriarch asked. This isn't about those either. They were all either destroyed in the war or dismantled as a condition of the ceasefire. But, in a way, they're a sign of the changes I refer to. At the start of the war, humans had adapted a much more sustainable method of resource acquisition, much like the autocracy. It's not as though they went from sustainable resource collection to ships capable of dismantling and devouring whole planets overnight. But by the end of the war, their desperate defense was consuming so many resources such things were necessary, something we had assumed entirely impossible before seeing it. This is how it works. Every little part changing constantly until the end result is new, but each individual change is easy to accept. I'm sorry to correct you, Instructriarch, but didn't one World Eater technically escape to the deep spinward traverse? The Instructriarch turned her head at the sudden correction and glared at pupil Quiliria. After a moment, though, she sighed and closed her eyes, rubbing the side of her beak. Yes, technically one did escape, but considering the spinward traverse is an empty void at the edges of the galaxy, with no civilized presence, and cut off from the newly formed Alliance territory, that the ship, like all the human lost fleet, succumbed to starvation and fuel outages to be abandoned in the void. But again, this isn't about that. The Instructriarch stressed. Also, from what I've read, the ship you refer to was a question about the nature of a vessel. If every piece is replaced, is the ship the original or new? Or, if one were to use all the replaced pieces and make a new ship, would it be the original or the other one? The class was quiet as Quiliria said that, reading from her data slate. What are you talking about? Who cares what's the original? That doesn't make any sense. The Instructriarch clucked after a moment. What if the World Eater met up with the lost fleet and created a new vessel that could survive in the traverse? Visan asked, and Instructriarch Tessie Woka finally snapped. Enough! She cried out, her wings lifting up and spreading out to their full size as she grabbed her disciplinary staff once more and waved it at the class while they shrank back in their chairs. "This is not an engineering class. This is not a real ship. This is how the humans adapt. Small, tiny changes that add up over time. This is the threat we face. Not a slow adapting foe that will follow the same tactics and strategy over time, but one that will constantly change. This is what I'm trying to teach you all. This has nothing to do with world eaters or actual ships." As the instructoriarch fumed and glared at the class, most of them were quiet and watchful as her dominant display of plumage was very clear. "But is the world eater idea possible?" Visan asked, and the class quickly scooted their desks away as the instructoriarch screeched out and brought her staff down on his head. Deep Spinward Traverse, System JX. 229. Once we're done with this panel, we've only got to finish attaching the regulator unit, and then we can head back inside for lunch. Supposed to be food paste gamma today, Foreman Hitachi mentioned as the crew around him worked to weld, solder, and fasten depending on their job. "Great. Food paste gamma. Just fantastic," Jinx muttered as she was stuck out on the far arm with Work Team Sierra. "All we ever do is work on this damn ship. New solar panels, greenhouses, foundries. It never fucking stops. Fuck, I don't even remember the last time we got to step foot on a planet we didn't then just crack and consume." Across the arm from her, Matt chuckled softly and nudged Old Man Deck with his elbow. "Did I ever tell you the story about how this ship got its name?" Old Man Deck asked as Matt carefully turned off his incoming sound on the side of his helmet. "Jesus H-titty fucking Christ, old man. If you tell us that stupid fucking story one more goddamn time, I will straight up murder you," Jinx hissed out and pointed her multi-tool at him from across the arm. But since his receiver was off, he didn't hear the threat. "You see, there was this ancient Greek philosopher?" It was as far as he got before Jinx screamed and threw her multi-tool at him. It struck him in the head and bounced off his helmet harmlessly before spinning off into the void. All around him, the rest of the work team was laughing, but the foreman saw the tool in the distance. "Jinx, that's coming out of your rations, you know," he called out. "One of these days, old man." She pointed at Deck before shoving off of the arm and jetting off after her multi-tool to grab it before it got too far. "Isn't she going to stay a while and listen?" Deck asked in confusion as the others laughed and Matt turned his receiver back on. "Oh yeah, Deck. She loves your stories." The multi-tool just slipped from her hand. The others laughed as the foreman just shook his head. Then he looked up at the massive ship that they were working on. To the bow was half a planet being broken apart and pulled into the massive foundries inside the mouth of the ship. It was more of a shell than a real ship, but it didn't change the fact that it was the largest spacefaring vessel humanity had ever made. Off to their starboard was Flotilla Praetorian. Flotilla Vanguard was scouting for another system to consume, and Flotilla Heimdall was watching for Autocracy ships. One of these days they'd have enough strength to strike back at their enemies. But for now they stayed quiet, breaking apart barren worlds to build up the fleet, and once they were done overhauling every part of the ship, well, then they'd start over again. After all, the work was never done on the Theseus.